This is part 2 of a 3-part series, so if an anime you enjoyed doesn't appear in this video, check out the first part. If it's not there, it might be in part 3, who knows? Not me, I'm not a magician. Like last time, if you disagree with any of my opinions, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, yada yada yada. Before we begin, as always, I just want to say thanks for watching and I hope you enjoy. I'm not really going to waste any time, we're just going to hop right back into this list and keep it moving. And we're going to start with King's Game, and you guys know how I feel about this.
Good. I'm glad those children are dead.
Listen, growing up, I had a deeply rooted hatred for volleyball thanks to PE class, so I expected to dislike Haikyuu. I went in with a dismissive attitude, but it didn't take long for me to fall in love with this anime. By the time I got caught up, I was already hungry for more. The characters all give off so much charisma, and it's even difficult to root against other teams at times. The narrative is pretty standard overall, with our main volleyboys wanting to win games. The heart of this anime comes from the character development and the personal arcs of not only Team Karasuno, but several other players from other teams. It's a beautifully animated piece of media with the kind of storytelling that hits some very well-earned emotional moments. Honestly, the only thing preventing me from giving this a perfect score is the fact that it's still ongoing. If the anime stays strong and closes strong when the time comes, I'd have no problem saying this is deserving of a 10. Dr. Stone is basically an anime version of Bill Nye the Science Guy. It hooks you right away with the premise of everyone on the planet being turned to stone, and the main character Senku's determination to fix the world makes you wonder what he could possibly do to achieve that goal. Dr. Stone somehow manages to make learning science so much fun while working it seamlessly into the narrative. Sometimes it seems like situations get resolved way faster than they should, but that's a minor gripe really. Overall, it's worth the watch, particularly if science in general interests you. Look, I love Demon Slayer as much as the next guy, but I also don't put it on a pedestal. It's got a wonderful art style, some seriously clean animation, a thrilling narrative, and, with the exception of Zenitsu in my opinion, some generally lovable characters. The distinct battle styles of the named characters is varied and visually stunning, especially Zenitsu's, even though I was just shit-talking him. At its core, it's a story about a boy trying to restore the humanity of his sister while also doing his job as a, you guessed it, child soldier. I do think it's too early in the anime's lifespan to give it anything above its current score, especially since we aren't factoring in the movie. I think this is where my opinion may start to seriously diverge from others. Attack on Titan is something of an anomaly in terms of its quality consistence. The story starts at breakneck speed, which really works in its favor because the tension is there. It hits the ground running and doesn't let up off the accelerator for a solid chunk of time. However, at a certain point, it does run into the same issues as Season 2 of The Walking Dead. By this, I mean the story comes to a screeching halt where nothing happens for long periods of time, to the point it feels like a completely different anime than what had even gotten you interested to begin with. This isn't an isolated thing either. There are plenty of times when the story just randomly decides to slow to a crawl. This is probably because there's so much complex and interwoven lore that needs to be given to the audience for the story to make sense, for better or for worse. When you're knee deep in the action, it's fantastic. Those scenes are full of kinetic energy and sky-high tension, but the lows of the show absolutely drag it down, kicking and screaming from having a higher score. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a perfectly average anime, even though as a kid I loved it to the moon and back. I never missed an episode on Saturday mornings, and if I did, I was devastated. As an adult, it's serviceable. The Pharaoh is probably the only actual character that isn't insufferable to listen to. The biggest detriment to the show's score is the fact that it has the same problems as OG Dragon Ball Z. Duels go on for multiple episodes, and even though the narrative tries to make it seem like Yugi is in trouble, he always finds some absurd way to win the duel. It's a formula that repeats over and over to the point none of the battles for the main protagonist feel like they have any stakes. Not to mention, if you know how to play the card game at all, watching characters break rules or do things they shouldn't be able to is kind of annoying. Nostalgia is the only reason I even bothered to put this on the list. So this might be splitting hairs, but I do consider certain segments of the Digimon canon to be their own separate anime, specifically anything with a subtitle like Digimon Tamers, Frontier, etc. So for this, I'm actually only talking about the original Digimon Adventure. I know Digimon Adventure 2 is a direct follow-up, but just like the others, it's considered to be its own separate entity. I also don't remember anything about it, so there'd be no point in me talking about it. Anyways, Digimon Adventure came at a time when the novelty of Pokemon repeating their names over and over was starting to wear off on me. Digimon had complex characters, or at least complex compared to Pokemon. The Digimon had distinct personalities and could actually communicate, and I really liked the idea of evolutions not being permanent, but more like using a special meter. There was a surprising amount of heart in the show stemming from the cast and their digital companions. The story takes a while to really get anywhere, but as it starts to pick up steam, twists and turns, you get to see some mature storytelling that was just absent from Pokemon. I know, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a Western cartoon, but I'm counting it. I know, I'm so brave. Anyway, this is one of 2 entries in this series that I consider to be perfect, especially since we can't count Haikyuu just yet. There's so much to talk about with Avatar that I wouldn't even know where to begin. The concept of the world is awesome, with each nation specializing in one of the 4 types of elemental bending, and the respective element being reflected in each nation's culture. The world of Avatar feels lived in, with so many threads tied to one another without ever losing the plot. The core cast is very likable, or in Azula's case, appropriately unlikable. But the writers don't get lazy and take each important member of the cast on fantastically written character arcs that change them in ways that are personal but tangibly have an influence on the story around them. The behaviors and motivations of everyone are explored and challenged, which makes them feel like real people with real flaws. If you haven't seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, please give it a watch. Okay, I actually strongly dislike The Legend of Korra. Props where it's due, the animation is even better than The Last Airbender's was, and I really loved the unique ways that bending was incorporated into civilization. That's what I liked. Might have missed it if you blinked. As for everything else, I was pretty unimpressed. Korra is a massive downgrade compared to Aang as both a character and an avatar. The cast around her consists of pretty generic people that don't add any value to the show or world as a whole. There's a huge focus on a love triangle that eats up so much time that could be used for actual storytelling, and the villains are mostly forgettable. The appeal of Aang's journey was watching him come to terms with the fact that he was the Avatar and all the responsibility that comes with it, and that made his journey to learn bending compelling. Korra begins the series knowing how to bend every element, which removes what could have been a neat journey. The rich cultures of the nations are also mostly replaced with modern industrialization, which feels like a pretty big loss in aesthetic and soul to me. I have no issue with legacy characters being mostly absent. I have no issue with the fact that the Avatar is a woman, or bisexual, or someone of color. My issues all boil down to how much potential went untapped. Korra could have been an awesome character and story, but we got something pretty aggressively mediocre instead. I watched Goblin Slayer because of all the fuss being made around the first episode. I could see why people had issues with how the scene was framed and kinda fetishized, but I went on to watch everything else too. Honestly, Goblin Slayer is a pretty average anime propped up by some pretty neat animation. It's like someone took a D&D campaign and made an anime, except all the adventuring party does is fight goblins. I wouldn't say it's a boring anime, but it's also not terribly thrilling. It's somewhere in the middle where it's comfortable to watch, but you're never left on the edge of your seat needing to see what happens next. When an episode ends, it's pretty easy to just decide to go do something else, which is probably the greatest criticism I can throw at it. You'd probably have more fun actually playing a D&D one-shot than watching Goblin Slayer. Admittedly, it took my friends a little bit of prodding to get me to sit through that time I got reincarnated as a slime. One thing I have to be honest about is when it comes to an anime, I am extremely picky about the art style, and slime has a very generic aesthetic. It's the same kind of art style that plagues most anime, and it doesn't appeal to me in its mediocrity. However, once I set my biases aside, I really enjoyed this show. The premise is fun, the characters play off each other well, and the story does take some pretty interesting turns, particularly in the second season. Underneath the bland exterior, the show has a lot of charm to it while still being able to explore mature themes. Slime is still ongoing, so I wouldn't feel comfortable rating it any higher than it is right now, especially since it didn't blow me away. Gunsword was something I watched in the summer of 2010 because I had nothing else to. It's kind of like a strange mixture of Trigun and the Mobile Suit series without really understanding what it was that made both of those properties memorable. The art style is kind of bland, but with just a smidge of edgy in weird ways. It comes across as dated despite coming out in the mid-2000s if I'm remembering correctly. It's not the worst anime I've ever seen, but it's also not worth your time. Being someone that loves psychological stories that come down to a battle of wills and wit, Death Note scratched an itch I didn't even realize I had in the anime world. The moral ambiguity of the characters, along with the themes of what justice means to the individual, what people do when they can't trust anyone around them, as well as what someone would do while wielding unchallenged power, make for some pretty spicy scenarios. The characters leave their own marks on a story that has so many twists and turns that you might need a chiropractor afterward, and there are tangible stakes with real consequences. I know people say the show goes off the rails in the second half, but honestly, I didn't mind it too much. Sure, I didn't like Nier as much as L, but it didn't ruin the anime for me. The second half is weaker than the first half though, which prevents me from giving it a higher score. Despite that, I do think Death Note is a must-watch. I am a massive Castlevania fan. Symphony of the Night is one of my favorite games of all time, and I have fond memories of playing Castlevania 64 despite it being an atrocious game. So when Netflix announced an anime series, I was instantly on board. Castlevania has a beautiful art style and exhibits some truly stunning animation, particularly during some of the big battle scenes. The story is appropriately dark for something bearing the Castlevania name, and the main characters are intriguing to watch in action. Where I think the show falls short is in its story. I couldn't put my finger on it during season 1, but something felt off. It wasn't until the most recent season that I finally figured out what was bothering me. It's not even necessarily that the story is bad, it's that the story feels incredibly rushed from a narrative perspective. Seasons of Castlevania aren't long, so plot threads end up getting burned through faster than it feels natural to. So many story arcs begin and conclude within the confines of these short seasons, some of which would have been incredible if the Netflix team had just slowed their roll a bit and really gave these storylines time to breathe. I think what it really comes down to is the episode count for each season. I know they want the turnaround to be relatively fast, but I'd rather wait longer for a 20 episode season with a well-paced, well-written story than be given an 8 to 10 episode season with an erratic pace and a subpar story. Hajime No Ippo was my first introduction to sports anime. My surprised enjoyment of this is what sent me in the direction of Haikyuu shortly afterward. First and foremost, Ippo is pretty long and is still ongoing. It's not catastrophically long, but it's not short by any means. What I enjoy about this anime was the very clear progression from zero to hero. You're there with Ippo every step of the way as he enters the brutal world of boxing. Every basic skill he learns, every technique and strategy he crafts, every win and loss, it all feels like it's happening to a real person because of just how much time we spend with Ippo. The characters around our main boy are just as interesting as he is with their own aspirations and flaws. Hajime no Ippo has that same kind of gritty art style that goes hand in hand with a lot of 90s anime. It can be genuinely funny and wholesome, but also devastatingly brutal and heartbreaking. My only real complaint is that the characters around Ippo can be kind of obnoxious and mean-spirited in their pranks, but that's a more personal nitpick than something that ruins the show. Even if you don't care about sports anime, I think you should give this one a watch. I actually don't want to say anything about Cromartie High School except for the fact that it's one of the funniest comedy anime I've ever personally seen. It's more fun to just send you in with absolutely zero context and let you experience the absurdity of it firsthand. So if you like to laugh, please check this out. If you don't at least crack a smile during the first episode, then I can't help you. I had no idea that gambling anime could be so interesting until I watched Kaiji. This anime excels at tension over what would otherwise be mundane tasks or games. The characters are pitted against one another for various reasons, to potentially gain enough money to pay off debts, to avoid being forced into shady labor camps, to avoid physical mutilation, and yes, to avoid being killed. It has the kind of mind games you'd associate with something like Death Note while properly executing a show of escalating challenge and consequences in a way that King's Game never quite reached. Kaiji rarely gives the audience a moment to breathe because it seems like our titular character is consistently falling deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. The only thing holding this back from a slightly higher score is that the final story arc really drags on and lacks the same confrontational aspect of earlier arcs in a very specific way that you'll understand if you watch it. The art style is also kind of hideous, and it does take some getting used to. I always found myself distracted by the artistic choices even well after those choices stopped bothering me. If you feel like being stressed out, watch Kaiji. I don't know a single soul that doesn't think Cowboy Bebop is damn near perfect. I can honestly sing its praises all day, but aside from the iconic lead character Spike and his equally memorable cast members, the mashup of contemporary modernism with the scientific flair of futuristic tech is an aesthetic that just kind of works without any additional massaging needed. Not to mention the well-crafted themes of emptiness and the heroic but tragic duality of a man that doesn't value his own life and what he does with it. The art is unlike most anime out there. The jazzy soundtrack gives the entire series its own unique identity outside of the visuals, and the story can be both hopeful and bitterly bleak. Cowboy Bebop checks off so many boxes that it's hard to argue against it in good faith. Do yourself a favor and watch this classic if you haven't already. Another classic battle anime, Ruroni Kenshin, comes from the same era of Toonami in the afternoon, just like DBZ and Yu Yu Hakusho. Just like Yu Yu Hakusho, I didn't actually watch this in its entirety until well into my adult life. Ruroni Kenshin is kind of like the samurai version of Trigun in the sense that the story follows an absurdly skilled wandering samurai that hides behind a smile and refuses to kill due to past circumstances. Unlike Trigun, Kenshin isn't wholly against violence and will put people in their place when necessary, giving the audience little glimpses into who he is as a person, slowly but surely, all while imposters hijack the nickname he used to go by to further their own goals. Now that I say it out loud, it is a lot like Trigun. Where Kenshin excels over Trigun though is in the anime's length. which allows us to spend more time with and around our protagonists so the world feels a bit more fleshed out. However, a downside is that while Kenshin's history is eventually explained in the anime, if you really want the full backstory, you need to watch the Samurai X films. I mentioned No Game No Life in my King's Game video, and I remember saying that it has problems of its own, which it does. But first, some good things. I really enjoy the world NGNL takes place in, as well as the tenets that bind the citizens together. The concept of using games to settle disputes because violent crimes and warfare are strictly forbidden is kind of ingenious, especially when those rules have interesting loopholes and implications baked into them. The artwork is beautiful, and I love that most things are outlined in colors other than black, which really makes the characters pop. The story doesn't move terribly quickly, but also doesn't feel like it drags. NGNL takes a lot of time for jokes and gags, and while some of this can be legitimately funny, I think it overstays its welcome pretty quickly and trespasses into the territory of being obnoxious. It bogs down entire scenes to the point I just wanted to skip ahead. But my biggest gripe with NGNL is the uncomfortable number of times in ways the anime sexualizes the protagonist's sister, who is 11 years old. Literally one of the first shots of her isn't even her face, it's of her panties, and the camera lingers way too long, and that's just how we're introduced to this 11-year-old. The fanservice overall really doesn't do it for me because I've never been a fanservice-y kind of person. No Game No Life was interesting, but I don't know if I can justify recommending it for you to watch, especially with no second season in sight. Well, that concludes the second part of this list for now. We've got one more video in the series, and then we'll be shifting gears to another short but fun list. So part 3 of this list is going to be delayed for a little bit because I'm knee-deep in the middle of a handful of anime, and I would like to talk about them on the next list. As before, feel free to agree or disagree in the comments with some opinions and ratings of your own. Take care of yourselves and others, and as always, thanks for watching.